Another thing that I love is I love to play games. You like to play games? I love to play games, especially when I win. I really like games when I win. In fact, I was at a men's retreat the other day, and after we were done with all of our Bible study and things in the evening, we played a bunch of games. I mean, we stayed up super late playing games, and they introduced me to a new game that I hadn't played. It was pretty complicated. It had cards, and it had little tokens, and I mean, the rules were incredibly complicated, but I really liked it. And you know why I liked it? I won. That's right. Yeah, I liked it. And so I thought, this is my boys. I've got a 9-year-old or an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old, and I thought they will really love this game. So even before I left the retreat, I got on Amazon and I ordered the game, and it probably beat me to the house, But so I got the game and I introduced the boys to it. I didn't like the game so much anymore, but they loved it because they won and I lost. But when you introduce a game to someone, what you do is the same every time. You tell them the rules and the objective, right? You tell them the rules, this is what you do. When it's your turn, you do this and this and this, and then you tell them what not to do. Don't do that or that or that. And then you tell them this is how you win, right? This is how you win. Here's the rules. And here's the objectives. Here's what you do, here's what you don't do, and here's how you win. And it's incredibly mechanical, isn't it? Games are incredibly mechanical. You do this, this, and this. Every time it's your turn, you do these things, and you don't do these other things. And then if you do all of those things right, and you're kind of lucky too, then in the end, you might just win. Here's how you win. And it's a lot of fun. And there are some things in life other than games that work that way, that we say, here are the rules, here's what you do, you push this button, you pull this lever, you turn this knob, and then this thing is the result. And you just do this every single time, just like this, and here's how it works, and it's all like clockwork. But there are other things in life that are not so mechanical. There are things that are not mechanical, they are relational. There are some things that you cannot approach like a game. You can't approach in a mechanical sort of way. Where you say, okay, just tell me the rules. What are the things I should do, the things I shouldn't do, and how do I win? You see, you can't approach marriage that way, can you? Maybe when you first got married, you thought you could approach marriage that way. Like, what are the buttons not to push, and what are the buttons to push, and what are the levers to pull, and how does this work, and how do I win? But it doesn't take very long to figure out that you can't approach marriage that way. You can't approach relationships that way. Some things are relational, not mechanical. You can't approach parenting that way. You can't approach friendships that way. These things are relational, not mechanical. So if you're asking, what are the rules? What are the things when it's my turn? What do I do and what do I not do? And how do I win? If you ask those sorts of questions, you're probably not going to win. You're probably going to lose because you're asking the wrong sorts of questions. You're approaching it as if it were a game. You're approaching it in a mechanical rather than a relational sort of way. And I'm afraid, church, that sometimes we have a tendency to approach Christianity as if this was some sort of mechanical sort of thing. Christianity, a relationship with God, a covenant relationship with God, is more relational than it is mechanical. And if we have this tendency to approach God and approach a relationship with God as if it was mechanical, just tell me the rules. When it's my turn, what do I do? What are the steps? Tell me what the things I'm supposed to do and the things I'm not supposed to do, and how do I win? When we approach it mechanically, we end up not winning. We end up losing because Christianity is relational and not mechanical. And you might be saying, well, whoa, I don't know that I'm so comfortable with what you're saying, Wes. Are you saying that there are no requirements? Well, no, of course not. Relationships have requirements, don't they? Relationships have requirements. If you're married, you know that relationships have requirements. If you're a parent, you know that parenting has requirements. If you have parents, you know that relationships have requirements, but the requirements of relationships go beyond compliance, right? The relationship requirements go beyond compliance. You see, a game doesn't care how you feel, right? It doesn't matter if you like the game or not. You can play the game. If you know the rules, what to do, what not to do, and how to win, then the game doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care about your thoughts. It doesn't care about your hopes. It doesn't care about your dreams. It doesn't care about your desires. But a relationship does. See, yes, my marriage, my relationship with my wife has requirements, but my wife cares about things more than just what time are we having supper and what time am I supposed to be home, right? Yes, there are requirements, but it goes beyond simple, mere compliance. My wife cares about more than just that I'm sitting at the table at dinner time. My wife cares about my thoughts and my feelings and my desires. And if she knows that I love her and I'm late to supper, that's more important that I love her than if I'm at supper, but yet my heart, my mind, my thoughts, my desires, my hopes, my dreams aren't with her. Because marriage and parenting and friendship and discipleship is relational, not mechanical. And so if we approach Christianity simply asking, what are the rules and how do I win? We've already lost. We're asking the wrong sorts of questions. We're approaching it as if it were a game. We're approaching it as if it were a machine rather than a relationship with Almighty God. And I'm afraid that if we really look at it, perhaps we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount is a great explanation of how Jesus not only approaches his relationship with the Father, but how he teaches his disciples to approach their relationship with God. And one of the primary differences between the way Jesus taught disciples to approach their relationship with God and the way that the Pharisees approached a relationship with God is exactly what we're talking about, isn't it? That the Pharisees taught people to approach a relationship with God in an incredibly mechanical way. They focused on compliance, whereas Jesus focused on conversion. The Pharisees thought, if we can make sure that everybody complies with the rules, here's what you do, here's what you don't do, and here's how you win, then we ensure that we have and we are a holy people. But Jesus knew that relationships, that the requirements of relationships go beyond mere compliance. And so Jesus didn't focus on compliance, he focused on conversion, changing people's hearts and minds. And he introduces us to a covenant relationship with God that cannot be approached mechanically and must be approached relationally. Look at Matthew chapter 15. We're going to look at Matthew 15. I know we're thinking about the Sermon on the Mount, but I think in order to understand the Sermon on the Mount, we really have to look at the dichotomy between the teaching of Jesus and the teachings of the Pharisees, because that's what it's all about, isn't it? As Jesus goes through the Sermon on the Mount, you've heard that it was said, but I say to you, this is how people tend to approach God. This is how the Pharisees teach you to approach God. But let me teach you the truth. Look at Matthew 15. He says, or the text says, then Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they don't wash their hands when they eat. And Jesus answered them, why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? Now, I think it's important for us to understand that the traditions of the Pharisees existed in order, in their mind, to help protect the breaking of commandments, or in order to prevent the breaking of commandments. In other words, we want to make sure we don't go over this line. And the best way to make sure people don't go over this line is to put a barrier back here to make sure that if they don't cross that barrier, then they're certainly not going to cross the barrier in front of that. It's the same reason we put guardrails on the highways, especially when there's a dangerous drop-off, right? We want to make sure people don't fall off the drop-off, so we put a guardrail there, and the traditions existed amongst the Pharisees and the religious people of the day to make sure that people don't break the commandments. Observe the Sabbath, keep the Sabbath holy, don't work on the Sabbath. Well, what does that mean? Well, could mean lots of things. So let's make all kinds of traditions in order to prevent people from crossing that line. So the Pharisees had all of these traditions in place, and it wasn't necessarily that their traditions were necessarily wrong, but they prioritized their traditions above the commandments of God. But they did that because they approached a relationship with God mechanically rather than relationally. And when you approach a relationship with God simply asking, what are the rules? What am I supposed to do and what am I not supposed to do and how do I win? And you approach a relationship with God that way rather than, as Jesus said, is the most important commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your mind and your strength. When you simply want to know what are the rules and how do I win, you will always end up violating the commandments because your heart isn't in it. And so Jesus asked them, why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? Verse 4, for God commanded, honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, if anyone tells his father or his mother, what you would have gained from me is given to God, he need not honor his father. So for the sake of your tradition, you have made void the word of God. You hypocrites, verse 7, you hypocrites, which of course is a word that means actor. You're an actor. You're putting on a show. You say you're concerned about these things, and you say you're concerned about doing the will of God, but you're not. You're concerned about keeping up appearances. And he says, well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, this people honors me with their, what, church? Their lips, but their hearts are far from me. So, in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. I think we have to understand, Jesus isn't criticizing them because they have traditions. Everybody has traditions, right? We have all kinds of traditions. We might not want to call them that sometimes, but we do, don't we? Wednesday night, that's a tradition, isn't it? We want to make sure that our people have the word of Christ living in them. We want to make sure that people know the book and that they spend time together. So we have a tradition of meeting together on Wednesday nights. That's a tradition. The Pharisees had traditions. The scribes, the teachers, the rabbis had traditions. He isn't criticizing them because they had traditions. He's criticizing them because compliance to their rules meant more to them than actually knowing and doing the will of God. And he said it manifests itself in things like this. You devote your money to God and you say, this money is devoted to God, so it's sort of off limits. Hey, that sounds like a good tradition, right? You say, okay, you can go ahead and devote your money to God. Your entire estate is going to support the temple, and you can sort of set it aside. That sounds like a great tradition. But what happens when mom and dad need you to take care of them? You don't. Because your tradition means more to you than knowing and doing the will of God. And if you knew and did the will of God, you would know that honoring your father and mother was more important than setting aside your stuff for the temple or for God. Because you don't really know and you don't really love. And so you don't really do the will of God. Your heart doesn't belong to God. Verse 10, and he called the people to him and said, hear and understand, it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person. Getting back to the idea of the washing of hands, because that was their criticism against Jesus and his disciples. They're not washing their hands when they eat. And he says it's not what goes in that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth. This is what defiles a person. Then the disciples came and said to him, don't you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying? And I always wonder, how long you been with Jesus? You think he cares? I'm not sure he cares. Verse 13, he answered, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be rooted up. Let them alone. They're blind guides, and if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit. They weren't blind guides because they didn't know the rules, right? They knew the rules. They knew the rules. They knew this is what you're supposed to do, this is what you're not supposed to do, and here's how you win. They're blind guides because they were focused on compliance, but they weren't really converted. It wasn't that they didn't know the book. It was that they didn't know the God of the book. They didn't know God. This is why Jesus says in Matthew chapter 23, he's talking to the scribes and the Pharisees, and he says, woe to you, because you're like whitewashed tombs. On the outside, you're beautiful. You're beautiful. It looks great. You look like you're keeping all the rules and doing everything you're supposed to. And if this was a machine, if this was a game you were playing, if it was just about pushing the right buttons and pulling the right levers and turning the right knobs, you would win. But it's not. Because inside, just like a tomb that's beautiful on the outside, inside, you're dead. You're like dead men's bones. On the outside, you're keeping on all the rules, outward appearances, and you appear to be righteous. But he says in verse 28 of Matthew 23, within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. See, a game doesn't care. A game doesn't care where your heart is, where your mind is. A game doesn't care what your dreams are, what your hopes are, what your desires are, but only what you do. Do you do all the right things and you avoid doing all the wrong things? Then you win. But a relationship with an actual person is so much different than that. Your spouse cares how you feel and what you think, where your heart is and where your mind is. Your kids and your parents and your neighbors and your friends, they care about this. And so does your God. And the problem with the Pharisees wasn't that they didn't know the rules. The problem with the Pharisees is that they were focused entirely on compliance and not on conversion. Their heart wasn't in it. Jesus would tell them, so listen to what they tell you to do. I mean, do it. They're wrong. They're right. They're not wrong. The stuff that they're telling you to do, it's right for the most part. But don't live like them. Don't be like them. Your righteousness has to exceed theirs because they're focused on compliance, not on conversion. Their heart isn't in it. You see, if you focus on conversion and you help people to love the Lord their God with all their heart and their soul and their mind and their strength, their compliance will follow. But if you focus merely on compliance and not on conversion, there's a good chance that their heart will never be in it. And that's why Jesus focused on the heart. Look at verse 15. But Peter said to him, explain the parable to us. They're still, focused on the washing of hands and wait a second, when you say we eat something and that doesn't defile us, but only what comes out of our mouth, what do you mean by that? It's a strange thing for a rabbi to say, isn't it? That it's not about the food. What are you saying? Like you could eat unclean food and it doesn't defile you, but what comes out? What do you mean comes out of your mouth? And Jesus said, are you also still without understanding? Don't you see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and it's expelled? But what comes out of the mouth? What comes out of the mouth? Your words. See, these proceed from your, what, church? Heart. They proceed from the heart. And this defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts and murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone. We're good religious people. We would love the Pharisees. The people of Jesus' day loved the Pharisees. Nobody thought of the Pharisees as the bad guys. Everybody thought of the Pharisees as the good guys. I mean, these were the righteous of the righteous. These were the guys that knew all the rules. If you wanted to know how to play the game, ask them. They were the experts. They knew all the rules. Here's what you do, here's what you don't do, and here's how you win. And Jesus says, but inside they're full of dead men's bones. They're hypocrites, and they're not really converted. They don't really love God. You say, whoa. How could you say that about the most religious people of Jesus' day? They don't love God. Jesus' proof for that is that when God showed up, Jesus, God in the flesh showed up, they didn't love him. And if they had loved God, they would have loved Jesus. They were focused on compliance and ignored conversion. And Jesus saying here in chapter 15 that because they're focused on compliance and not on conversion, because inside they are really defiled, isn't it incredibly ironic what Jesus is saying? I mean, think about what he's saying. He's saying, listen, it's not about washing your hand, although especially now, y'all wash your hands, okay? But just say it's not about washing your hands, and it's not about the meat that you eat or don't eat. It's about what's in here. And if in here, even if it's not out here, even if it's not in the things that you're doing, if there's theft and false witness, if you're lying in your heart, and you're stealing in your heart, and you're committing adultery in your heart, and fornicating in your heart, you are defiled. I mean, isn't that incredibly ironic that he's saying about the most seemingly undefiled people in Israel? The people that made sure, man, I gotta wash. I might have touched something that somebody else touched, that a Gentile touched, and that Gentile touched that thing, and then somebody else touched that thing, and then I touched that thing, so now I'm defiled. And Jesus says, don't worry about it. You were defiled long before you touched that. Because in your heart, there's a serious problem going on. And that's where you need cleansing. And because your heart is wrong, everything you touch is defiled. You can be so focused on compliance and inwardly defiled, and everything you touch is defiled. See, this is what the Sermon on the Mount is all about. It's about conversion over mere compliance. Conversion. That's why Jesus starts the Sermon on the Mount talking about things like what? Poverty of spirit, mournful, meek, hungry, and thirsting for righteousness, merciful, pure of heart, peacemaking. People that rejoice in the face of persecution. See, people that just want to know the rules. What do I do? What do I not do? How do I win? When persecution comes, the last thing in the world they're thinking is, praise God. May God be glorified in this. May I be strengthened in this. May this be refining for me. That's the last thing in the world a person who approaches a relationship with God in a mechanical way. When he's persecuted, he says, wait a second, God, this isn't how it's supposed to work. I was doing everything right. But a person who approaches it like a relationship, can say, God, this hurts, but I'm with you. And I'd walk across a bed of fire for you. So it's the same thing that you do if you love your spouse and you go through hard times together. And you say, I'm in it with you. In sickness or in health, for better or for worse, no matter what, I'm in it with you. Because we have a covenant with each other. And that's how we have to approach a relationship with God. This isn't a machine where you could just push the right buttons and pull the right levers and turn the right knobs. It's about having a righteousness that exceeds that of the Pharisees. It goes beyond not murder. Jesus says it goes beyond not murder. It's about not hating. It goes beyond not fornicating. It's about not lusting. It goes beyond following the divorce laws. It's about faithfulness to your spouse. It goes beyond loving your neighbor. It gets to loving your enemy. It goes beyond just praying and giving. It's about praying and giving when nobody's watching. It's about laying up treasures in heaven. Yes, relationships have requirements. Yes, we will comply with those requirements if we're in a relationship with someone. But if we merely focus on compliance, the conversion never comes. And so, church, we've got to stop every now and then, don't we? Unless we think there's no way that I could ever fall into the same trap of the Pharisees. Do we think that? I mean, come on now. I mean, these were people that in their adult life did very little else than study the Scriptures and think about what we would call spiritual things. Yet Jesus says, you got the compliance thing down pat. Outwardly, you appear to be incredibly righteous, but inside, you're full of dead men's bones. And I, for one, don't think that I'm beyond falling into that trap. And so I have to stop every now and then and look in the mirror and say, Wes, are you focused on conversion or on mere compliance? On making everybody think we've got it figured out. When it's my turn, I do the right things and I don't do the wrong things, and I'm just focused on how do I win? Or am I in love with Jesus? Am I in love with the Father? Am I overwhelmed with joy to be filled with the Spirit? And to say, you are mine and I am yours, and we're in this together, and I love you with all of my heart and my soul and my mind and my strength. We got to stop and ask that personally. Are we focused on conversion over mere compliance? But as many of us in this room are also teachers, teaching children, teaching adults, or elders, or deacons, encouragers and leaders, people that have conversation publicly or one-on-one with different people about what it looks like and what it means to follow Jesus. What are we focused on? Are we focused on conversion or mere compliance? How are we encouraging people to follow Jesus? Are we encouraging them to approach Christianity and discipleship and a covenant relationship with God mechanically or relationally? Are we encouraging people to simply ask, what are the rules and what is the objective? When it's my turn, here's what I do, here's what I don't do, and how do I win? Are we encouraging people that that's what discipleship looks like? Our goal has to be the same as Jesus' goal. Conversion over mere compliance. If our goal is simply compliance, then we should just be content with just tell people the rules. Just tell people how they're messing up and what they need to do right and how to win. If it's just about compliance, let's just stick to that. Just stick to telling people the rules and tell people when they broke the rules, right? But if it's conversion, if our goal is conversion, and church, it's a lot harder for our goal to be conversion rather than just compliance. It's a lot easier to just focus on compliance. It's a lot harder to touch the heart. But if our goal is conversion, then we have to help people fall in love with God. If our goal is conversion, we have to reach in and plant seeds in people's hearts. We have to be content with just being seed planters and seed waterers and leave the growth up to God. We have to be content with just saying, here's the message, here's what God is calling you to, and leave it there. We have to be content to allow them to give what they've purposed in their heart. Isn't that what Paul said? It'd be a lot easier to say, okay, listen here, church, here's the rules on giving. When you give your time, when you give your energy, when you give your money, here's the rules. It sure would be a whole lot easier to pay the church bills if that was the case, right? And we just could tell people, here's the rules, here's what you have to do, here's what you have to give. But instead, when Paul was encouraging people to give, he said, you have to know what Jesus has done for you, and then you have to give what you have purposed in your heart. He would tell the church, listen, I'm not always going to be there to look over your shoulder, to make you do the right thing in the right situation. I'm not always going to be there to remind you of the rules. Don't do that. Do this thing over here. So here's what you have to do. You have to grow up into your salvation. You have to work out your salvation. You have to become the men and women that God wants you to be, that Jesus wants you to be. Church, if we're going to be teachers and we're going to be leaders, if we're going to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, then we have to focus our teaching and our leadership and our encouragement on conversion over mere compliance. We have to touch people's hearts. We have to let them grow up. We can't be content with mere compliance. We can't keep encouraging people that this is what discipleship looks like. It's just like a game. It's just like a machine. Here's the steps. Here's the knobs to turn. Here's the levers to pull. Here's the buttons to push. We have to help them to understand that this is a covenant relationship with God, with Him being your Father, with Jesus like being the groom to the bride that is the church. That this is relational. And yes, there are a lot of requirements in relationships, but those requirements go beyond mere compliance. And so we must go beyond mere compliance. Thank you, church.